We're in the shadow of Grenfell Tower here, looking up at not just that tower, but the various towers around it. I mean, not just in London, wherever you live in the country, you'll see towers exactly like this around you in towns and in cities. And inevitably, concerns have been raised about the safety of these buildings, the safety of tower blocks right across the country. Many of them were built in the 60s and 70s. Many of them have been renovated in some ways. But what about safety? Well, Oliver Wainwright is the Guardian's architecture and design critic and a trained architect himself. Hello, Oliver.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm okay, thank you. Are we looking up at these? There are two right in front of us. Looking up at these buildings, how safely were they designed back in the 60s and 70s?
Well, it's ironic because actually buildings of that period were designed when our fire safety standards were probably the most stringent they've ever been. They were designed to withstand fire. They were compartmentalised, so if a fire broke out in one particular flat, it definitely wouldn't spread or be very unlikely to spread to the rest of the building. The problem is, over the last 2 decades, we've progressively undermined the safety standards of the 60s and 70s by doing these retrofit projects, which are generally predicated on increasing the sustainability and the kind of thermal credentials of the buildings, which obviously is important. But while we've improved the insulation and thermal capacity, we've actually undermined the safety standards. So what we've seen in the case of the Grenfell Tower, you know, the likelihood is that it's this extra insulation that's been put on the outside which actually accelerated the spread of fire in a way that would never have happened in the 1960s if the buildings had been left alone.
I mean, we look up at these now, and there will be people probably listening to us talking right now who are living in flats and buildings just like that. If you're up there on the 20th floor as we look up now and a fire breaks out, how are you supposed to get out?
It is an issue that faces tall buildings, but generally the stay put policy is the right one unless the building has been overclad in an incorrect manner, and there's no way of knowing really, if the facade has been done to the right standards or not. I've been speaking to a lot of architects and surveyors today who say when they look at the technical construction drawings of these renovations, they're fine, they should withstand fire, but the reality is the way some of them have been built on site, the kind of construction quality doesn't actually live up to the original architect specification. So I think what we need to do is actually introduce much more stringent checks. Building control needs to be much tougher than it is at the moment in terms of inspecting the quality of workmanship on site and actually ensuring that the right kinds of fireproof materials are being used and corners aren't being cut.
It's extraordinary to think that, as you describe it, these buildings, when they were originally built, are safer than newer buildings now.
I was speaking to an architect who graduated in the 1960s called Sam Webb, who was actually the guy who foretold the collapse of Ronan Point in Newham. And he said it would be unthinkable when he graduated for a building like this to have caught on fire in the way that Grenfell Tower did. So he's heartbroken to have watched over the last 50 years our standards get progressively more sloppy. And it's actually interesting, in Dubai, which has suffered a similar series of fires to the Grenfell Tower, this year they're actually introducing what's probably going to be the world's most rigorous fire legislation, where the materials, rather than being kind of tested for fire individually, they're going to insist on a complete facade mock-up of every new building being tested. So it's not just the insulation on its own, it's not just the cladding on its own, but the makeup of all the materials, how they behave in a fire, which is, I think, sadly what we lack in this country, that level of testing.
Is there a future for buildings like this? Because they will need to be refurbished. That need won't go away. And if there isn't a safe way to do it, what happens next?
Well, there is a very safe way to do it, but it's just that corners have been cut. Completely non-combustible insulation is readily available, but it's just a little bit more expensive than the kind of flammable insulation that seems to have been potentially used in this case. So it's a question of just putting the money and the technical skills where we need them, and saving more lives. It's eminently possible to renovate buildings in a safe way if we don't cut corners and if the government stops cutting capital budgets to local authorities.
Thank you, Oliver. Thanks for that. Oliver Wainwright, who's the Guardian's architecture and design critic, himself an architect. And